Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about something that is not yet Malazan again, because I am not yet back with reading any of that. Nope, today we're going to talk about Wonder Tales by Salman Rushdie, because I bought the book, Languages of Truth, and it's exactly the first essay in that series, in that collection. And my plan is to read the entire thing and go and pick some of the more interesting essays and ramble about them. So today we're going to ramble about the first one, which is the one that made certain other people very angry. And I can tell you, it made me angry as well. So welcome to talking about Wonder Tales, shall we? Apparently not. Let's try this again. Ah, cheers. So yes, Wonder Tales, an essay that was apparently originally published in the New York Times, which is fine. And it deals with the role of the fantastic in literature. It's written by Salman Rushdie, author of a ton of books. Some of them have magical or fantastical elements in them. I read, for example, the one called 2 Years, 8 months, and 28 Days, which obviously plays with the Tales of 1,001 Nights, or Arabian Nights Tales, or whatever you want to call them. And those have genie in it and other stuff. So, there's that. So, a few things are important here. First of all, this is not an academic essay. It does not, actually make any really good arguments or anything like that. It's more a literary think piece by someone like Salman Rushdie, who knows how to put words in pleasing forms, and knows that he knows that. That's something that's stuck with me while reading the entire essay, and we're going to go into why that's a problem in a couple of seconds. So that's important. Now, the main argument that Rushdie advances here, after waffling about all kinds of things, is that there is room within what you might call serious literature, or in literary fiction, for the fantastical, and it is at least as interesting or as important for good books as is an attempt of realism. Now, this is obviously not exactly a new argument. It has been made before by other people. But it's fine, nice that someone like Salman Rushdie goes out and says the same, that, what, actually, fantastical elements can help us understand things, can teach us stuff that, make books interesting. That's, as I said, not a big deal, but if he has finally if he finally feels that it's worth addressing and maybe defending it against other trends within literary fiction, especially of the last 150 years or what have you, of a trend towards more like realism, or what you may call realism, then yeah, good on him. Because there is obviously that idea that literature, serious literature, if has to be somewhat realistic, or be as realistic as possible. It has been there forever, not forever, but for a long time, that trend. Why is that? Now, the idea, maybe one of the ideas that I have there is that, or theories that I have there is that, there's two of them. Point one, once people that think about books started doing exactly that, one idea that has been prevalent is that what literature does is it helps us understand the human condition. And from there, it's like an easy step towards to the point where you say, if I want to, understand the human condition, we need to portray the human condition in all its aspects. Ideally, we do that by portraying all kinds of human lives in all kinds of situations. And if we mix that with, or add like supernatural elements, fantastical elements, that will distract us from perceiving the human condition. Now, that argument is obviously bullshit and false, but I guess it's understandable how people can come to that conclusion. So that's the one reason, not the only reason, but that's one reason why why a lot of people who think about books or talk about books in a respectable manner, I guess, prefer ultra realistic depictions of the human condition, ideally of the more tragic part of the human condition, because that's another aspect that we're going to go to in a second. The other part there obviously is that bias that AP has mentioned in his discussion with Philip Chase. The problem is that once we started thinking about literature, or like at that time, a lot of like the literature that people were starting to talk about was very realistic literature, especially, for example, in Germany, of like German realism with all these like books like by authors like Fontana and whoever. That was just like something that or in England, like a lot of like Henry James's novels, just not The Turning of the Screw, because there's like ghosts in there, or maybe not, who knows. Those have been for a long time, or your Dostoevsky, another one of those people, and that has come to like different academics, disciplines. When you read philosophy of literature, or parts of that, which is generally called aesthetics, those people mostly, when they try to make points about what they try to say, take recourse to these kind of books. There's probably no author more heavily quoted by philosophers, like when it comes to fiction, or no other work than Anna Karenina. That book gets like taken as an example every single fucking time. Similar, William James, Martha Nussbaum, who is an amazing philosopher and has amazing points to make. So if you feel like reading these kind of books, go read some Martha Nussbaum. She's good. She's incredible. Much smarter than me, but she tends to mostly look at works of this kind of realistic literary fiction. William James being one of her favorites there, or some more modern American short stories, and go into a similar direction. And now, if you see that kind of literature is praised by academic circles, you tend to read that stuff as well, and you tend to write the same stuff. And once you reach that point where you are where you are praised by those circles, those respectable circles of literary criticism and whatnot, it kind of perpetuates from generation to generation. So that's, I guess, the more pragmatic part of why, even now, when you hear like a lot of literary critics write about stuff, or in your print magazines and whatnot, they prefer this. There is that preference for what you might call realistic fiction, which, once again, there's enough arguments about why that is not actually realism and whatnot. That's the next part that we're not going to talk about here, but maybe later at some point. So the idea that Salman Rushdie is arguing against, that idea being that for whatever reason realistic fiction is preferable or somehow better than fiction with fantastical elements in it. That idea exists, and Rushdie is right in challenging that. I have no issues with that whatsoever. But I think, especially in modern conversations, this has already changed a lot, because the discourse has moved away from those places in a lot of ways. So I feel that argument, making that argument, is fine. It needs to be made. I just don't feel the urgency anymore, especially not from someone like Salman Rushdie, who has been a highly acclaimed and highly successful author in those circles, right? It's not that he is someone who just sells pulp stories to weird tales. He's not that kind of author. He's been highly praised by exactly those circles. So he personally does have like basically no reason whatsoever to defend the magical element, the fantastic elements in his stories against those serious literary critics, because they already love his books and praise his books. He's already part of that in-group, so it feels a bit more like token protest or whatever. I don't know. But anyway, he doesn't make a lot of like really good arguments there. In general, because what he mostly does is show off his knowledge of Indian and also, yeah, literature, of world literature, which is fine. He name drops a lot of like other authors just to be on the safe side. There's of course the Cervantes mention. There is obviously, and I'm personally very happy that he mentions that. There is a mention of Winnie the Pooh, which is one of the best books ever written, if not the best book ever written. So go read that book. Tolkien gets a favorable mention. Narnia gets a favorable mention. Ursula K. Le Guin obviously has to get a mention. I'm very happy she gets one because she's a fantastic writer. But yeah, so it feels rather self-serving and self-important, because there's very little argument actually about the idea that fantastical elements can add to literary fiction. Now, yes, they can, but we have to take his word for it, more or less. And I'm fine with that. I feel it would be nice to further explore what specific things fantastical elements can add to a story. But maybe I'm weird that way. Now, let's look at two other parts there quickly. I mean, the idea of it having to be more like dark and it having to be dark and like sad and whatnot. Story elements within within literary fiction, serious, realistic literary fiction that are mostly praised. I am not quite sure if this is the place. It might just actually be worth talking about that phenomenon in like a separate video. I feel it has to do with our idea that we kind of expect things to come at a price, and for whatever reasons, we kind of feel that sad and negative stuff is more serious and thus has more to offer than just like sheer happiness, like the connection of happiness with children, and like less substance in whatever way in a lot of like public, like our general worldview is a huge problem that we should probably address in a separate video. Now we come to the other part, the part that made everyone angry, or hopefully everyone angry, because it sucks and it makes me very angry indeed. The bashing of fantasy. Here we come to like a couple of problems. Because for no apparent reason, and this I feel is important here, for no apparent reason, Salman Rushdie thinks it is necessary to make sure that everyone understands that the fantastical elements that he adds to his stories, and those being some kind of fantastical literature, are not the same as what he calls schlock fantasy. And there's no reason for him to make that distinction. He just does it to collect some brownie points. And it's a very cheap trick, especially because he obviously positively, in like a positive way, mentions accepted and thus acceptable fantasy, like The Lord of the Rings. For whatever reason, he also seems to not bash on Harry Potter, which is totally bash-worthy at that point. No, he picks two others. He picks The Hunger Games and Twilight. And it just comes across as bullying. We have like highly respected author of serious literary fiction, respected in all these circles, Salman Rushdie, pick two books series that are basically young adult fiction, and calls them trash. And I'm like, you know what? That's cheap. You're like that schoolyard bully kicking the smaller kids. That's dumb. You're not playing the same game. Twilight and the Hunger Games are not typical fantasy fiction. They are very specific YA romance and dystopian novels. Now, I have not read Twilight. I don't think I will ever read Twilight. It's totally not my thing. I've watched the first movie though, because I went to like a sneak preview of whatever, and that's what I got. I have, however, read the Hunger Games series. Now, I'll just say I've read much worse. It's not good. I'm not its target audience, but I've also read worse stuff out there. I still feel the idea, like, first of all, making that distinction is ridiculous. It seems he just does that to, pander to his audience in the New York Times and, like, people who buy essay collections by highly, like, praised serious authors, to pander to them by, you know, trashing something that has, at this point, mostly been accepted as absolute trash, that being Twilight, and something that has at least not, one universal praise, that being the Hunger Games. It just feels cheap at this point, because by using these two books, he avoids, actually talking about serious, like the larger field of fantasy. And he then makes a distinction between what he writes, that being magical realism and fantasy fiction. And that's bullshit, because you can't make that distinction in that way. Now, does magical realism exist? Of course. Can you put what Salman Rushdie writes into the broader, like, area of magical realism? Of course you can. And he, of course, mentions all of those South American authors. He even mentions Borges, so I'm happy with that. But magical realism is just one specific tradition or school or subgenre of fiction. And if we define fantasy as books that contain stuff that is beyond or outside of what we might call the empirical universe, like all kinds of magical or whatever supernatural elements. If that is fantasy, that contains mythology, that contains fairy tales, fables, sword and sorcery, urban fantasy, epic fantasy, military fantasy, supernatural romance, magical realism. There's tons of shit that all fall under that, but you can't just take one of those, subgenres or schools or traditions. And I would, mostly say it's a tradition or a school that has specific tropes and elements in it. You can take that. You can't take that and say, like, this is one thing and the rest is fantasy. No, you are writing fantasy in that broad sense. Now, is the name fantasy, the definition fantasy, in that case a useful definition? Hell no. You want something more specific, and it's totally fine to say, I like books of the magical realism school. I'm happy if you say that. I do like some of them myself. I personally, for example, don't like supernatural romance. I'm probably not its target audience. I'm pretty sure there exist great supernatural romances out there. And also a lot of trash. I'm pretty sure there exists really shitty magical realism out there. Just like how these things work. So that weird distinction that he makes there is a highly stupid distinction, because he kind of works with like two words there that are you can't actually make that distinction, is what I'm trying to say here. And it's cheap, and it pisses me off, because we know that magical realism is one of the traditions of fantastical fiction and has been accepted as serious literature over time. So of course he will think of himself as part of that. But you can't distinct. It's still fantasy in that regard. It is, if fantasy is, and I think that's the only way to define it, because otherwise we'll come into all kinds of hot water. If it's books that feature stuff that we can't find in this world we inhabit, then magical realism is fantasy. Or like, what would he do with an author like Ian MacDonald, whom I absolutely love, and his book Desolation Road, which is maybe a science fiction book, but more likely a book that you might call magical realism, because it uses a lot of those elements and plays with a lot of those elements and stylistical elements and tropes from magical realism. Is that now schlock? Is that magical realism? It's ridiculous. Is what I'm trying to say here. So let's kind of bring this to a close in a second. To summarize, Salman Rushdie's argument that supernatural or fantastical elements have a right to be part of literature, of fiction, and can add to what fiction can give us humans, is a good argument. It's not necessarily a revolutionary argument at this point, but he's not trying to revolutionize. He's trying to sell books, and probably got handsomely paid for that article in the New York Times. So good for him. The idea that he has to go and bash other books to for whatever reason, to pander to his audience that thinks of itself as sophisticated, is cheap and ridiculous. The fact that he chooses two books aimed at a young adult audience, and one of them that is generally has been generally trashed for 20 years, makes him come across as a cheap bully. That's what mostly rankles me here. It's like yeah, come on. It's very much like punching down. Is there an element of maybe envy or jealousy there? Because probably Twilight sold more than even the most successful of Rushdie's books. I mean, I don't have the numbers here, but I suspect Twilight sold more than the Satanic Verses, which I assume is probably Rushdie's most successful book. I don't know. So I'm not guessing at motives here. I'm just looking at the fact that what he does is morally reprehensible, because it comes across as cheap bullying and punching down. And it's unnecessary for his argument. Completely unnecessary. And then what he does then, by trying to separate what he writes from fantasy, he makes the mistake of using the school that he belongs to, or counts himself into, that being the tradition of magical realism, which has mostly been a South American thing, but not exclusively, and tries to separate it from fantasy, which is just not how this works. Magical realism is one subset, one subgenre of the fantastical literature, just as all these others. There's no such thing as just fantasy. It just doesn't exist. The fact that at the same time he also favorably mentions books and authors that have been accepted to what you may call the overall kind of canon of acceptable books, like The Lord of the Rings, for whatever reason, the at least as trashworthy as the Hunger Games Harry Potter series, Narnia, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, all that stuff. That he mentions those shows even more clearly that distinction between fantasy and magical realism that he's trying to make. That magical realism being acceptably sophisticated literature and fantasy being trash. Just doesn't work that way. Because I've read magical realism. I've read The Lord of the Rings, and I can tell you one thing. The Lord of the Rings is not magical realism. Neither is Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh is just like plain good literature. But, so yeah, he just like, his argument doesn't work on all these levels. That's sort of my thoughts on this book. I mostly disliked on this essay. I mostly disliked it for making Salman Rushdie come across as petty, self-important, petty, and a bully, which, you know, is never a good look. I hope that other essays in this series will be, in this collection, will be more interesting and better and have like less shitty points to make. Anyway, let me know what you think about this one. Let me know if you want to hear more about like essays from this collection. Thanks for watching, liking, subscribing, do all the good things. I really need it. I'll talk to you tomorrow about something else. Until then, cheers.